In April 1820, with the Industrial Revolution gathering pace, 7 carts brought the Reverend Patrick Brontë, his wife Maria, their 6 young children and their worldly possessions to Haworth, fast developing from a medieval village into a mill town on the edge of the Pennines in Yorkshire. When he died on the 7th of June 1861, he had outlived the rest of his family, and the Brontë legend was already in the making. Their personal and tragically short lives is a story that, in many ways, is stranger than the fiction they wrote. Today, Haworth and the surrounding area is known worldwide as Brontë Country, and literary pilgrims come in their many thousands to visit their home, Glebe House, now known as the Brontë Parsonage, and the many places known to them in the area. From the pens of Charlotte, Emily and Anne came numerous poems and, amongst others, the classic novels of Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Their writings were in the main inspired by people they knew and the places and landscapes in which they lived most of their relatively short lives. Although more than 150 years have passed since their deaths, many of the buildings and places known to them in the area survive. So today's visitor to Haworth can still get a feel for the village as it was then, and walk on the seemingly unchanged moors on its doorstep. Whilst many places of habitation seek shelter, this cannot be said of Haworth. The cobbled Main Street climbs steeply out of the Worth Valley onto the top of the Scarp, fully exposed to the elements. At the top of Main Street, ready to slake your thirst, is the famed Black Bull Inn, with the village stocks nearby. A hostelry has stood here since the founding of the village in medieval times, and it is where Branwell, the only son of Patrick, socialised and gradually fell into a state of almost permanent drunkenness. As is normal in many villages, the church stands adjacent to an inn, and within only a couple of steps from the Black Bull are the church gates. The present building is thought to be the 4th to occupy the site. Records of the Archbishop of York show that in 1338 a chantry of charitable endowment was attached to the Chapel of Ease that then existed. Chantries were abolished in 1547, but in 1559 money was raised to purchase land at Stanbury, which was vested in trustees to produce an income for incumbents. William Grimshaw became minister in 1742 and was responsible for the building of the church Patrick Brontë knew. Following his death, the present church was built in 1879. It only retains the original tower, which had been heightened in 1870 to accommodate the clock. Inside the church you will find plaques and some artefacts, and a brass plaque marking the site of the Brontë family vault, in which they all lie with the exception of Anne Brontë, who is buried in Scarborough. Outside, on the south and west sides of the church, is the packed graveyard, which tells us much of those who have passed before. It is estimated that over 40,000 were buried here in the churchyard, and with the water supply for the village passing beneath, it contributed greatly to the foulness of the water. In the centre of the wall dividing the parsonage garden from the churchyard is a plaque marking the place where a gate used to be. Because the Brontë coffins passed this way, it became known as the Gate of the Dead. Close by is the grave of Tabitha Aykroyd, a faithful servant of the Brontes, as well as the Brown family monument. John Brown was sexton for Patrick Brontë, and his daughter Martha became his family servant at the age of 10. After his death, she briefly went to Ireland with Charlotte Bronte's husband, the Reverend Arthur Bell Nichols, but returned to become servant to Dr. Ingham, who had attended Charlotte at her death. She became known as Misdemeanor, and she tended to wallow in the reflected glory of the Brontë fame which followed quickly after their deaths. John Brown lived in this house, close by the church, and was one of Branwell Bronte's drinking companions at the Black Bull. The adjoining Sunday school was built by Patrick Brontë in 1832, and the plaque on the wall records this. It is little changed since being built. A little further up Church Lane, access is gained to what has become a shrine to the Brontes, the parsonage, and if you are visiting Haworth for the first time, it will be on your must-see list. Built in 1779, Glebe House stands solidly facing east over the graveyard, the gabled extension to the right being added in the 1860s. Everything possible has been done to recreate the rooms as they would have been in the 1850s, although some interior structural changes have been made. Many historic artifacts are on display, and even if you are not a Brontophile, you should allow 2 hours for a visit, after which you will almost certainly become one. Are you able to resist the call of the moors? Looking out towards Dimple's Quarry, now disused, it is not difficult to imagine the sisters heading out from the parsonage on their long walks. Before that, let us look at some other buildings of interest known to the Brontes. The old Sun Inn nearby on the Stanbury Road has its own ghost. Across the road you will see the Wesleyan Methodist Church, which was built in 1758, the third building to occupy the site. The Baptist Chapel close by was built in 1752 and enlarged in 1775, the additions being paid for by public subscription. On the opposite side of the road is a car park on land cleared in the early 1970s when many of the old cottages were pulled down, including a small prison house. The area is known as Town End. The old manor house was spared this clearance, as were some other picturesque cottages. One on Changegate has the initials ISAS 1671 over the door. Looking south towards Keighley, a large Georgian house called Spring Head can be seen. This was home to Joseph Greenwood JP. As its name suggests, one of its wells was in public use in 1850. A little further on is Ash Mount, the home of Dr. Amos Ingham, physician to the Brontes. This now provides bed and breakfast accommodation for some of Haworth's many visitors. Before the Brontë Society acquired the parsonage, its collections were displayed from 1895 to 1928 in the upper rooms of the old Yorkshire Penny Bank. It now serves as the Tourist Information Office and, as you would expect, is very busy during the summer months. Adjacent is the Old White Lion, which was one of 4 public houses in this central part of the village. The King's Arms opposite is probably the oldest, and this was used as the Manor Courthouse from 1748 to 1870. What is now a greengrocer's was the Cross Inn, and of course there is the Black Bull. Now signed Rose & Co. Apothecary, this property belonged to the druggist Robert Lambert, who supplied laudanum to Branwell Brontë. Laudanum is an opium and was sold openly in Victorian times. An alleyway below Emma's Cafe leads to an area called the Rose, and from here you can look towards Keighley. Looking down Main Street from the Black Bull, the cobbled road surface and many houses remain pretty much as they were built. At the junction of Main Street and Sun Street is Haworth Old Hall, a good example of an early 17th century yeoman's house, and now a hotel. Opposite is Hall Green Baptist Church, built in 1824. It was a separation from the original West Lane Baptist. A little further along Sun Street was the village green and ducking pond where scolding women were punished. Needless to say, this is now defunct. Further along is Woodlands, a large Georgian mill owner's house, occupied at the time of Charlotte Bronte's wedding in 1854 by a Mr. Butterfield, one of only a very few people invited. The Haworth clustered around the railway station in the valley bottom was mainly created by the Industrial Revolution, where many houses and mills jostle for space. There can be no escaping the Brontes in Haworth. Without them, it is unlikely that the village would look as it does today. It may have been completely redeveloped or demolished. The Yorkshire Pennines provide the dramatic backdrop to the village and inspired the Bronte sisters with many aspects of their most famous works. While seemingly unchanged, they are somewhat different than in the middle of the 19th century. Ever-increasing populations has demanded a greater need for water, and the hills now contain many reservoirs as our water resources have had to be carefully managed. The gaunt ruins of lonely farmsteads dotted all over the moors were once occupied by families trying to make a living from the harsh landscape. The classic walk for Bronte devotees is from Haworth to Top Withens, said to be Emily's location for Wuthering Heights. From the churchyard you take a path that leads past Sowden's farm, which served as the parsonage before 1779. From here you continue over Penistone Hill on a well-trodden track with good views of Stanbury. This descends to cross Sladen Beck at a place known as the Meeting of the Waters. Here you will find the Brontë chair, where the sisters would rest, and also the Brontë waterfalls, crossing the stream by, of course, the Brontë Bridge. You will continue for another mile or so, generally uphill, to reach the lonely ruin of Top Withens. Almost certainly habited in the mid-1800s, it has gradually degenerated to the sad ruin of today. Here it is not difficult to put yourself in Emily's shoes, and Wuthering Heights comes to dramatic life, whatever the weather. The location is indeed perfect, but the building never was. The most likely candidate is thought to be High Sunderland House, unfortunately demolished in the 1950s. Close by are Alcomden Stones, another place almost certainly visited by the Brontes, which always seems to have an aura of mystery with its connections with the ancient Druids. Descending from Top Withens towards Stanbury, two more places associated with Wuthering Heights can be visited. The gritstone outcrop of Pondon Kirk is without doubt Penistone Crag in the novel, and Pondon Hall is reputed to be the site of Thrushcross Grange. Again, the house bears no resemblance to the one described by Emily, and we have to look further afield for an appropriate model. Shibden Hall, near Halifax, seems to fit the bill, and Emily would have seen this and High Sunderland House when she briefly worked at Law Hill School, Southwarm, in 1839. Stanbury was probably of Anglian origin and typical of the area. Like Haworth, the village was transformed by the Industrial Revolution, and textile mills sprang up in the valleys close by. All have now gone, the ruins of Griff Mill being all that remains to remind us of those turbulent times. The village of today is a pleasant place to live, and the lowly cottages once occupied by handloom weavers are now desirable residences of character. Quakers escaping persecution came here in the late 1600s, and their burial ground is at Horton Croft, marked by a simple modern cross. Patrick Brontë helped to raise money for the Anglican church and school, which was opened on the 4th of September 1848. It is thought that Charlotte taught here occasionally. It was simply known as Stanbury Church until 1998, when it was dedicated to St Gabriel after 150 years. The manor house was built by George and Mary Taylor in 1753. A descendant of his, Stephen, a church trustee, lent Patrick Brontë 2 of the 7 carts to bring him to Haworth in 1820. In 1835 the Taylors bought the Cross Inn, and further descendants were responsible for the carving over the door in 1926. In the 1980s the inn was renamed Wuthering Heights. The Friendly Inn was opened by William Robinson in 1850. Some of the original cobble street through Stanbury survives today. Another not-to-be-missed opportunity whilst in Brontë country is a visit to the charming village of Wycoller, which has major Brontë associations and many extremely interesting and picturesque features. All vehicles must be parked in the car park just outside the village. Walking into the village, you will soon be aware that you are entering a special place. It was deserted for a time in the 1950s and 60s, as at one time it was proposed to flood the valley. The houses are now all occupied and have been converted into desirable residences. Wycoller Beck is crossed by a number of bridges, all from different periods. There is the 13th century double-arched Packhorse Bridge, and upstream is a clapper bridge, possibly even older in origin. Further upstream, and definitely older than both of these, is the Clam Bridge, originally consisting of one slab, but it has been broken and restored. It is probably over 1,000 years old. Wycoller Hall, built in the late 16th century by the Hartleys and later extended by the Cunliffes, is today an evocative ruin. Thought to be the inspiration for Ferdine Manor, Rochester's second residence in Jane Eyre. It certainly fits the bill. Charlotte Brontë would have heard from the villagers a tale of a madwoman who had set it on fire, a tale she wove into the dramatic destruction of Rochester's first house, Thornfield Hall. Further on, and now restored and serving as a visitor centre and display area, is the magnificent aisled barn, originally built in the 1630s, and beyond this is an ancient piscary or fish pond. The opportunity should also be taken to see some fine examples of vaccarie walling dating from the 13th century. Vaccaries were cattle-rearing farms, from the Latin vacca, cow, and because of the preponderance of large flat stones in the area, these were used to make cattle enclosures. The passage of time has not dimmed the fascination we have with the Brontës, and interest in this literary family seemingly continues to grow. We struggle sometimes to recreate the past, even though it becomes increasingly difficult. But it is the brooding moors that really capture the essence of the Brontë novels and prose work. Although changed, they do remain essentially as they were 200 years ago and have a timeless feel about them. The places and landscapes continue to inspire the visitor to Haworth today, as they did the Brontës in the first half of the 19th century. A little and a lone green lane that opened on a common wide, a distant, dreamy, dim blue chain of mountains circling every side, a heaven so clear, an earth so calm, so sweet, so soft, so hushed an air, and deepening still the dreamlike charm, wild moor sheep feeding everywhere.